So welcome to this webinar. I'm Kirsty Wells and I'm an Assistant Director with ARK Consultancy, and ARK is celebrating 35 years of business this year. I'm not sure if everybody knows about ARK, but we're a management and technical housing consultancy providing a range of services to clients in the housing and charity sectors across the UK. The theme for today's webinar, in terms of igniting culture change in housing professionals, originated from conversations that we had with Vikki McCall, and you're going to hear from Vikki this morning about culture and leadership in the sector and how we can support individuals and organisations to embrace change in how they function so that they can deliver positive outcomes to tenants and residents and hopefully improve employee satisfaction and retention. And before I introduce the speakers, I'd just like to frame the session in a quote from the Grenfell inquiry when the final panel recommendations were televised. And Turia Istefan, one of the inquiry panel members, said in that televised session that we need changes in culture and behaviour. If we are not professionally curious, then we won't become technically competent. So I just want to leave you with that thought as we go through today's webinar, and hopefully you'll engage with us and join in the conversation as you hear from each of the speakers. I'd just like to introduce the speakers now. So we're going to hear this morning from Vikki McCall, Helen Scurr and Shaun Harley. Vikki is a Professor of Social Policy in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Stirling, and she teaches the postgraduate MSc and Diploma on Housing Studies. She's won the Rate Award for Excellence in Teaching in the Faculty of Social Sciences in 2016, 2019 and 2023, and her work includes leading projects focusing on housing, ageing, stigma, co-production and the role of frontline workers, service users and volunteers within the policy process. Vikki's a principal investigator on UK-wide projects including intersectional stigma of place-based ageing, or the IPSA project, which is currently being funded by the ESRC up until 2027. It's a 5-year project. Vikki's also the Honorary Secretary for the Social Policy Association Executive Committee, and she's an editorial board member of Social Policy and Society. We'll then hear from Helen Scurr. I'm sure Helen will be familiar to lots of you. Helen is one of our executive directors and has worked at executive and senior level with both housing organisations and charities during the last 35 years. And she's had strategic and operational responsibilities for housing and property services. Within ARK, she's led on and been involved in a wide spectrum of assignments, and she leads our people and development business streams and works with executive teams and boards to lead on our governance and cultural reviews. And she's led on major engagement initiatives, which have included tenant and resident engagement activities. And then our final speaker this morning, we're really delighted that Shaun is joining us from Lincolnshire Housing Partnership. Shaun is currently the interim CEO at LHP, and he joined LHP in 2022 as the Exec Director of People and Change after more than a decade working for Homes England, where he was the agency's Director of Communications, and he led several culture and digital programmes, including its approach to hybrid working. Shaun grew up on a council estate in Teesside, so he's really passionate about the purpose of social housing. And when he moved to LHP, he wanted to have more direct impact on communities. He's also a mentor for the Social Mobility Foundation and a board member at Peaks and Plains Housing Trust. So I'd like to hand over to Vikki now, and Vikki's going to take control of the slides and work through her own presentation. Thanks, Vikki.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. That was a very big introduction. Thank you so much. And it's a real delight to be here and have the chance actually to pause and reflect myself on what I've learned through the decades now of teaching housing professionals across the UK. And I think what spurred this webinar when Kirsty and I started thinking about this and we're chatting about this is we realised that it all really leads back often to cultural change, and that's something that's been reinforced through my teaching and reinforced through all of the research that I do in terms of how we tackle stigma in the housing sector as well. And the timing of this webinar is also slightly coinciding with a paper that I published with my colleagues, especially Professor Kim McKee. And I'm putting in the link to that in the chat for people if they wanted to see it. It's an open peer-reviewed journal article. And I suppose I was sharing with Kirsty my delight and shock that people were actually reading one of my academic journal articles, and quite rarely I was getting emails from different people in the sector to say, we've just stumbled across this. It's the first kind of peer-reviewed journal academic level theory for the housing sector on reflection. And that's quite shocking, actually, really. That's why we wrote it. We know that social work, education, the health sector are a lot further forward in terms of these elements. And it looked like, and it sounds like, and this webinar I think will reinforce that the housing sector are ready to delve into this subject. There is momentum and there is timing around it, which I think I want to talk about reflection, but what we're talking about really is how that changes individuals in terms of their kind of cultural approach, but also organisational culture. So Kirsty's been very nice to give me a lot of time to indulge myself around this topic. So it is going to be the lecturer hat is coming off. And I want to introduce this whole idea of and contextualise how we make an impact in the sector. I think I'm very privileged to be able to be connected to so many professionals in the housing sector who are trying to make really amazing changes, social impact, that sometimes often always have a lens of empathy and solidarity. I worry about the people I don't see as well. And how do we then snowball out the best practice around how we make people-centred decisions and people-led decisions in the cultural sector that are also aware and take consideration of the structural barriers that constrain our discretion. And then how do we take the next step around that and embed positive cultural change? So that's kind of what my talk this morning is going to be about. And then I'll present the model of which we had developed in the paper that I shared with you. I suppose I want to give you the bigger picture of the why, and then also the how, and then examples from my amazing students on their reflections that they've done over the years to give a little bit of insight of how powerful it can be to pause and reflect. So I suppose Kirsty's already indicated the wider picture in terms of we're in a post-Grenfell and post kind of AWAB's law element where, as we know, when it goes wrong in the housing sector, it can go really, really wrong. So recent tragedies within that have been key drivers for example, mandatory qualifications and wider debates on professionalism in the UK context. I'm probably in a room of people who think that the housing, or have a really good idea of what the housing sector is, but that is still debated. You know, there's still these questions of what is the housing sector, who is included in that, and therefore that's why the idea of professionalism is still a little bit wobbly. You know, that old adage, Malpass, and it's the housing being the wobbly pillar of the welfare state because it's got a foot in the private sector, it's got a foot in the public sector, and that has, I think, affected the idea of housing as a profession. And we've worked really hard and ongoing in the last 10 years to make it more in terms of our profession and embed professionalism in the sector. That is because a lot of what we've seen in terms of the changes from the recent tragedies have been traced back to stigma, and they have been traced back to indications of racism, etc. So often it has been, and I was part of that professionalism review, it has been traced sometimes back to individual behaviour, but also not an inclusive organisational culture. And if anyone's read Peter App's book, you know, Show Me the Bodies, we can see a pattern emerge in terms of the way that people are treated in terms of stigmatisation, and that has been an issue that's faced social housing tenants within the UK. they've been problematised and often demarcated as the other, as opposed to owner occupation and the normalisation of that in the housing sector. And I think that's been attached to this idea of professionalism, and the professionalism element of what we want to nurture combats that at its heart. So I suppose the question we're posing today is, how do we combat that? How do we combat stigma, and how do we develop that positive culture? And in that review, significant changes were noted that needed to be done, especially to drive up those professional standards. And it said that the key role actually does sit with organisational culture and leadership, and the role that plays in delivering services that are both high quality and person-centred. The nub of it is, and I don't think there's any getting around this, is the feedback from the recent tragedies is connected to how people felt they were treated. Right, they were ignored, undermined. And how do we combat that in terms of helping individuals become more person-centred and professional? And how do we then mirror that at the organisation level as well? Well, there's a few ways that we've tried to do it in housing. We're doing it all of the time, I think, and we take different lenses towards it. I really like what's happening and what I've been hearing, for example, from Sanctuary around trauma-informed practice. We also, of course, have personal development planning. We have a big emphasis on CPD, continuing professional development now as well, person-centred practice, reflexivity, the whole professionalism agenda. We're trying to embed and tackle stigma, etc., through qualifications and training, ethics, code of conduct, professional standards. And I'm very honoured, I just actually joined the board of the Professional Standards Committee for the CIH, and supervision, mentoring. We oversee critical incidents reviews, lessons learned reviews. All of these are different ways on how we combat stigma and make sure we're, embedding professionalism in an ongoing and systematic way in housing. And I suppose it's really difficult to do that, and I don't know why that's formatted slightly differently, but you'll all remember Joe Richardson's work, around the profession of housing. And I indicated earlier that housing sector itself is debated, and that makes professionalism and what that means debated. And I think that's made more difficult as well, because yes, that wider wobbly pillar picture, but also what does it mean to be a professional in housing is so different, and the routes into housing is so different, and I think that's made it more challenging. And I love Joe's here. We need to be multi-skilled, flexible, resilient, good at listening with people's skills, alongside being self-aware and critically reflective. That's what housing professionals need to do, because we do everything. I like to say that actually I think in housing we're the grey area of social work. We're the ones that are papering over the cracks of the welfare state. Never mind being a wobbly pillar, I think we're holding it up. As other places are retreating, housing is kind of folding itself into the cracks and trying to keep it together, because we're at the front line. We're in people's houses. We see the things we need to see first and foremost and try to tackle them. But that doesn't make it easy in terms of being a housing professional and embedding a kind of coherent culture in the organisation. So that brings us back to reflection. And to do that, to be ongoing, to tackle stigma, to be the individuals we want to be, we have to not just think about what we do, but why we do it and how we change in terms of the learning that comes to us as we go and how we evolve. So the capacity to reflect on action is to engage in a process of continuous learning. And although I'm biased, and I do think qualifications are a part of that picture, this is much wider than that. This is about having default professionals that are able to stand back and reflect, learn and evolve, because we do have roles in the housing sector that need that evolution all the time. And to go back to the theory of this, other professions are much further forward than us, but it does all link back to these original reflective theories about how do we take experience, something's happened, reflect on that, what happened effectively, so what then, what happens, and then planning so what. So it goes from, what to the why, and to the now what. And this is the foundation of most reflective practice. And it's really hard to, it looks simple, it looks very simple, but it's very, very hard to do. And there are different levels of reflection around this. There's descriptive reflection, just understanding and contextualizing the situation. That goes on to dialogical reflection. How do we consider and link it to the wider elements? How do we feel about that as an individual? How do we impact others? But then, most importantly, how do we get to critical reflection, being aware of the wider picture and how that restrains us? And that's hard to navigate in a sector that's really complex, really nuanced, is very changeable as well. There are examples of people doing that. For example, here's the CIH CPD's learning cycle: plan, action, reflect. You know that it's very cyclical usually, and reflection is critical to personal development. We identify it's good for career development and actually embedding housing as a career, because remember that old adage, people just fall into housing, etc. And it strengthens it overall when we're able to show and reflect on professional activity as an essential part of what we do. But it is all linked to organisational culture as well, or leads it to that. So that's quite high level. That's the theory in terms of what's underneath what I want to talk about today. And I suppose we're in a sector where I hope I've made the case that we need to do it as well. So on that learning, I've had hundreds and hundreds of housing professionals come through a programme, and we make them reflect on what they do. So everything they do, every module that they do, whether it's looking at providing housing studies, whether it's housing services, whether it's sustainable communities or organisational behaviour or healthy housing, we make them reflect on what they're doing as professionals, ask themselves how they've learned that, what they've learned from that, and what they'll do next that's very differently. And we've presented this model of reflective practice, we call it the reflective housing practitioner, to help people along the way in terms of the key steps to becoming a critical reflective housing practitioner. And the first one is that understanding of what's going on. It seems a simple way to start, but sometimes it's difficult when it's hard to pin down what is going on. And it's about describing activities around us and then taking that next step to say, okay, that's happened. What's the impact on me? And really understand your own positionality and also your own biases, your own ethical practices, your own integrity, because we all come to life as a different lens. If we're women or if we're from a different ethnic minority background, we've all got a way of looking at the world, and it's important that we reflect on that and then show and think about the impact on us, how it's made us feel. Then, and only then, I think, when you're contextualised into the situation, you understand what's going on and you understand your role, you can think about person-centred practice, which is the next one, which is showing empathy, yes, but empathy can be a little bit passive. It's also about solidarity and taking the next step to stand with others as well. It's also about action to show that we stand with person-centred practice. So these are the 3 steps first. So, contextualize what's the impact on me, and then what's my impact on others, and show empathy and so on. And then we can get to grips with power and critical thinking, how the wider structures around us shape our learning, shape what we can do, and how we can then change them to be more equal, fair, and progressive. So these are the steps that become a reflect, and it never ends. It's cyclical. You just keep going around these things. And let me show you some examples that bring this to life. So these are quotes from our students, which are in the paper, that show really positive ways in which people have been reflecting and how they learn. So here's one from a student who's came into the housing sector from the education sector and highlights that they're a little bit further on than us. And here we see, throughout their teacher training and employment, they realise that the importance of self-reflection and professional development is embedded in that culture. That's an incredibly important link. And I don't think it's something we've cracked as yet in the housing sector. But I consider my ability to self-reflect and find is a strength. And that's, I think, what we need to sell to the housing sector. Being critically reflective of what's going on is a sell. And there is a chance then when we embed that in our culture, it stops disasters happening because we're listening better, we're taking on board what other people say, being less defensive. And maybe taking risks as well in terms of person-centred approaches and helping people at the heart and taking that as the default setting. I'm afraid the whole quotes have, for some reason, perhaps can't be seen, but I will read out the important parts in terms of some of this feedback and reflection. One of our professionals saying, as a housing officer of a tenant, I can see the differences this has made to health in terms of what I have done. I've known that my actions changes their demeanour, how he interacts with me. I feel that doing a qualification, a degree, has helped me know how to advocate for tenants and ensure they get the support they're entitled to from their services. I know I'm the first point of contact for many vulnerable people, and that is invaluable. And a lot of my job is just trying to tell people how important they are in the housing sector, as giving them the confidence to know how they affect people's lives so significantly by the work that they do. And the other quotes, and I'm sorry if I'm not sure if it's coming through on your side, but on my side, I'll read this out. What I find particularly interesting is the discussion of the relationship between policymakers in the centre and those with operational delivery. So this is somebody starting to reflect on the gaps between policy and practice. Here's how they carry on. Mine was often a role which faced criticism for failing to know what it's like in the real world. My experience has taught me that policy cannot be made in isolation. It needs to mean something to those delivering it as well as those affected. So here we see some powerful reflection. So somebody in a role as a policymaker in the housing sector, showing how other people has their opinions have affected them, but then reflecting on how they are affecting others, that policy is not made in isolation, that there is effects on the decisions they're making into people's lives. And I think that's really, really powerful. And imagine everybody reflected that way. Imagine that was the default way that people started to think about things in the cultural sector. So this is another interesting example of powerful reflection, and maybe one that's familiar to a few people in the room. I'll not read this all out, but I find this comes up again and again, that people are taking on a role in a council. Maybe it's a gatekeeping role, maybe it's something where they are policy says no situation, and that really affects people as individuals, and they find it difficult to get out of that, and it sometimes stops them being person-centred. And just this one here, reflecting on my role as a service manager within a local authority, I make decisions daily that affect other people's lives. And I think that's really critical reflection. And we might forget that I need to talk to people. I may find, the summary here is, I might get defensive because they're in this powerful role, and I'll get defensive because some people will treat me a different way because they see me as an officer of the council, etc. So here's one. When people voice their upset over my decision, I feel bound in an almost inhuman public face of the council. But in doing so, I further compound this idea of the impenetrable larger structures having power over the individual. And I think this reflection really highlights and maybe gives insight to what's happened in situations such as Grenfell. We have people that are thinking they're the face of an organisation, but that face isn't a person, and they're taking the person out of the organisational culture in different ways and struggling with them kind of embedding, actually, we should start with empathy and solidarity and listening to people and their needs. Because here's the key question that I pose to you all, and you'll have questions for me, I'm sure, but what happens when organisational cultures and systems stop listening to people? And I think we know the answer in some ways. That's when disasters such as Grenfell happen, and that's when disasters such as young toddlers dying of mould and damp happen. And reflection is a powerful tool of which we can actually listen as organisations and individuals, which will embed the default and normalisation of empathy and solidarities with others, and that becomes cultural change. And I'm not saying that's easy. in any way, shape or form. And I think it's actually one of the key challenges that we have in the housing sector. And cultural change is really easy to bomb. It's very easy to, it's very easy to break. It's so easy, but it's really hard to create a positive and progressive culture in an organisation. But you can't have it without reflection, empathy, solidarity, and having people standing back and understanding where their roles sit in the organisation and how their decisions affect others, but also how they protect themselves within the organisation from burnout and so on as well. It's a very tricky balance being in the front line of housing. That's definitely what I have seen in terms of my students and so on. And there's lots of place to spin. We're the wobbly pillar, we're challenged as a profession, we have to be a bit of everything and all thing, and we have to evolve and be flexible. So the key challenge is, how do you embed positive cultural change there? And I suppose what I'm saying is one of the answers is to embed learning, to embed qualifications, and to support people in CPD and ongoing learning, and giving people the space to be reflective. And that's really tricky when it's whack-a-mole and it's chaos and everything that's happening in the housing sector, legislatively wise and policy wise, affects us. But if we forget why we're doing it, and to protect the people working in it, and teach them how to protect the people that we're serving, then we'll never get to where we want to be as a housing profession. So thank you all very much for listening, and I hope the paper is some nice bedtime reading for those who can't sleep. Thank you.
Thanks, Vikki. I don't think we have any questions coming through yet, so I'll just wait to see if anyone wants to raise their hand. But I guess for me, Vikki, one question, I quite like this definition of we're a bit of a wobbly pillar, and particularly working with other professions. And I really like in the paper the definition of solidarity and that collective commitment to act, which is, that stronger step than empathy. And I just wondered, in some of the thinking that you've done, and obviously now you're involved in the professional standards group, have you had conversations about how that solidarity works kind of both horizontally and vertically within organisations to kind of embed that culture change?
So that's a really interesting question, and a big nod to Joe Richardson's and Tony Manzi's work, because they are the ones that were very, very adamant in how we have to connect housing management to solidarity. So, and what we have in that understanding is we might see a little bit of more solidarity at the ground level where people are interacting with tenants and so on. But without that solidarity at the top level in leadership, that'll never work, because it has to be embedded and supported at all levels. What we're seeing at different levels, I would have said at the ground level, one of the key challenges is empathy burnout, is where you do have very much, I don't think anyone really goes into the housing sector without wanting to make a change, without wanting to support people, without wanting to make a difference. But if you think of it as a little bit, I have a well of sympathy and solidarity in me. If I give it all out and spread myself too thin, then I burn out myself. And I think sometimes I've seen in later, people maybe been in the profession 20, 25 years, 30 years, the patience with what we would maybe call interesting tenants go down, because their empathy has been given out and so on, and it's really difficult to bring that back. And I think we do have a role in this, in protecting our people at the ground level. So I suppose my proviso is, I think empathy and solidarity are unbelievably important, but there's a little bit of a tipping balance as well in terms of where we work there. So what I've seen is sometimes too much empathy and solidarity at the ground level. And what people need at the ground level is the support of the leadership in that, and the backing. So that's maybe sometimes the way around that we have it. So we need also, in our sort of showing solidarity and empathy, the backup I suppose, is what I'd say, the backup from all levels of the organisation. So people feel empowered to say yes, they feel empowered to help tenants. And there's been some lovely examples of that. That makes me think of, the weekly group say yes culture, where there was the people at the front line were given a certain amount of budget so they could just lean in. If tenant needed it, they could say yes. I think delegating discretion to support and empowering people at the bottom line is one of the key ways we can do that.
Okay, thank you. That's great. We've got 2 questions for you. So, Kat and Heather, if I'll just bring you in. If you'd just like to tell us where you're from, that would be great. I'll take both questions at the same time, if possible. So, Kat, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm from Lincolnshire Housing Partnership.
Don't steal Shaun's thunder.
No, absolutely not. I wouldn't be able to. So I work in organisational development, which is, I think I'm sometimes seen as a bit of an idealist, and you're absolutely right, Vikki. I'm 3 months into the organisation and the sector, and you do come in with great desire to do wonderful things, and I think it's interesting for me how you balance that natural empathy and that being the right thing, and it's baked in there in our values, and how that clashes with we've got risk, we've got legal, we've got lots of experience in the organisations, and I wonder, does the sort of fear of taking responsibility and the fear of litigation have an impact on our kind of accountability and empathy drivers? Because we want to say, yeah, we have a societal fear of saying I'm sorry because there's a consequence if we're sorry, and I wonder how you balance that with that kind of empathy piece.
I do think our risk and I do think sometimes our more regulatory driven KPIs and culture does combat it. It is sometimes a barrier to an empathy, person-centered culture. I'm just going to put that out there. I do think that, because when I have a look, I think regulation at its heart is trying to avert these disasters, that have happened. But I like to question: are we sometimes measuring the right thing? Does tenant satisfaction tell us if we've got an empathy or solidarity driven culture? It's a tricky thing, and I see it in, for example, the experiences that I have in my research around adaptations and accessibility, and I work with a lot of older and disabled tenants, and the Scottish Housing Regulator have some things that are said, how many adaptations do you do? And they also ask, though, what's your void turnaround time? So this is just one example. So if you're driven by a quick void turnaround time as one of your elements that you have to do, then you're not able to take the window of time to then say, right, am I giving this house to the right tenant? Am I able to take my time and make the allocation right, the right match, and do a person-centered match in terms of allocations and need? You're not driven to then take the time to adapt that house in terms of the tenant going in and any needs they might have. So I would say that's just one example of the tension of what we're regulated with then the space that we've got to take a person-centered approach in practice. So I would like to see much more alignment there with, say, our KPIs, with our professional standards.
Okay, thank you. Heather, we'll just take your question. You've been waiting patiently, and then we'll move on to Helen. I can see, Kai, that you've asked a question as well, but I'll keep that till the end of the discussion. So Heather, do you want to come in and tell us where you're from, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Heather Thomas. I'm Chief Executive of Sapphire Independent Housing, which is a smaller housing association in Northwest London. I'm also Action Chair of the group of G320 group of smaller associations in London. And thank you, Vikki, for a really interesting presentation, which really, really spoke to me as somebody who's been working in housing for 40 years. And I just wanted to, I don't know if it's a question really, just say 3 things and maybe get your response. You talked about stigma, and in fact, we've got a conference next month where we're going to have someone talking to us about stigma in social housing, and I know the CIH is doing a lot of work on that. But I wonder if it's a wider problem of what I would call, and I think there was a report called years ago by Julia Unwin about a lack of kindness in public policy generally. And I think that particularly applies to social housing. So I think we're up against that. It's not just a housing issue. When we talk about public policy and people receiving services, the way that we talk about it as a state, if you like, it is not with kindness. We only have to listen to what's being said at, the Labour Party conference at the moment to hear what government is saying about services and people. So I think that's an issue for us. It's kind of wired into the way that we do things. I also wonder about, we talk about housing management and housing officers and repairs quite a lot. I wonder, having worked in a larger organisation now, leading a smaller one, about the structure and power of housing associations, because I think some of the terrible things that have been identified were known to customer-facing staff. I'm not going to say frontline because it makes it sound like there's a battle between us and residents, and there isn't. So customer-facing staff. For example, I believe the caretaker at a Grenfell Tower on the Grenfell Tower estate, he actually identified that the closures to the fire doors were an issue, the fact that they weren't working. And I think he took them into the office and said, we need to do something about that. And as far as I know, he was ignored. So I think a lot of customer facing staff know the issues. They just don't have the power within their organizations, particularly if they're large, to get that voice heard and get it taken seriously. So I think there is a real issue for housing organizations where we need to look at the structure and power within them. And yes, I think giving budgets to housing management staff is important, but I think it's actually beyond that. And if you look at the way that we've moved to customers service centres, so you've got customer service staff who are taking all the calls, receiving that, but that they're away, they are well away from maybe the neighbourhoods that people are servicing, and they're well away from the senior managers that actually hold the budgets and make the decisions. So that's another thing for me. And finally, I think just final point that Kat made, and I think you said, what gets measured gets done. And certainly the regulator of social housing, it's 7 VFM metrics. None of them look at social impact. They are looking at cost per property, return on investment, gearing. They are not looking at the social impact. As a result of that, that's what drives a lot of the behaviour in housing associations, because we want, and I'm owning up to this, we want our VFM metrics to look good. And those VFM metrics do not include anything about social value, human capacity, human capital. It's just not there.
No, I would agree. Thank you, Heather. Very quickly, Vikki, do you want to just give a quick response, and we can pick up some of it up at the end of the session as well in a wider discussion?
I could give quite a quick response, and I just agreed with everything Heather said.
Okay.
So I think the kindness element is a lovely way to frame it. And the stigma I look at is that wider stigma, Heather, which is a very prevalent and powerful process. And my experience working with professionals is that hurts them. That hurts them, and they find themselves being advocates in solidarity to tenants, and one-to-one with that, and dealing with these things, but also having to deal with sticking up for their profession to others, that is widely taken for granted, or not talked about very nicely in the media. Most people in the housing profession are unbelievably angry about how social housing especially is treated, and social housing tenants are treated in the media. And they see that as part of their role of combating that, but it doesn't make the job easier. And I guess I just agreed with you. I think we need empowered in a much wider sense to be confident to listen and work upon and build really good relationships that go two ways with tenants, because that's where the solidarity comes. It's not just that passive empathy, it's about doing things with people as well. And it's unbelievably important. And I agree, the current way that we're measuring things does not support it.
Okay, thanks, Vikki. Okay, on that note, I'll ask Helen to join us now and run through her presentation with you. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Kirsty, and thank you, Vikki. Really interesting and insightful presentation. I'd certainly recommend everyone to read your paper if they've not yet had the opportunity. And again, Heather, I think lots of nods there in terms of the points that you were making. So I'm Helen Scurr. Thank you for the introduction earlier, Kirsty. Gosh, 35 years, where's that gone in the housing sector? I feel particularly privileged that I actually started my career as a housing officer and knew all of my tenants because I actually only had a patch of 300, which is quite unusual now. So a lot of what you've talked about in terms of behaviours, Vikki, and empathy and empowering people, all sounds very familiar to me. So what I'd like to do today is share some of our experiences of working and supporting a whole number of clients across the UK in conducting cultural assessments. So we work with small organisations, very large organisations, to really help the executive teams and the boards understand the cultural drivers within those organisations. Unfortunately, that's often triggered by either a tragedy happening in an organisation or a new chief exec joining an organisation. It isn't something that people do generally. It is generally as a result of an issue emerging. So today I thought I'd like to share my thoughts on sort of the operational, the strategic issues and challenges that we're currently seeing experienced by the sector, a number of which has already been outlined by Vikki and through some of the conversation this morning. I'd like to share with you the common themes that we identify in organisations, and that's both from employee and tenant feedback, so how people are generally feeling, and also what we feel needs to change to almost reshape housing organisations now, and that's about building a future for tenants and housing professionals that everyone can feel proud of to be part of going forward. So just in terms of sharing my first slide, I hope you can all see that. My colleagues can nod. Yeah, wonderful. So just, I suppose, thinking about some of the strategic challenges, and I have to say, working as part of an executive team or part of a board, you are juggling so many competing priorities at the moment and so many challenges. It feels that it possibly could be one of the most challenging times we've experienced for those of us that have been in the sector for a number of years. So, I mean, firstly, just looking at reputation, and Vikki talked about, some of the horrendous disasters that we've seen over the recent years around Grenfell and Awab Ishak. But we are really seeing organisations now feature in the spotlight for the wrong reasons. That's not always recognised as the amazing work that all of our organisations deliver and the support that is delivered by people to tenants and residents. The reputational risk to organisations now, organisations are seeing the issues around compliance failures, and that impacts everybody in businesses. It impacts every member of staff who are trying to do a really good job, and it impacts tenants and residents who are seeing their organisation, their landlord featured in the press, and not always positively. Increasing expectations of central government, build more homes, invest more money, decent homes too now heading our way at a rapid pace, and having to respond far more quickly now to the regulator and the ombudsman. Those again are competing priorities that we're seeing clients have to grapple with every day. Boards and executive teams are often dealing with lots of tensions. How do you balance ensuring you've got headroom in your business plan, financial viability alongside with customer expectations, and actually ensuring that your colleagues are happy and feel that they are heard and listened to? So lots of competing priorities and tensions there for senior teams. And when we're carrying out cultural assessments, we see that frequently. And we see that from staff that are delivering frontline challenges right the way through to board members. And competing priorities. We touched on regulation earlier. The regulator, I'm absolutely confident it's about trying to ensure that they deliver the best possible services for tenants and residents. It does create issues for organisations in their ability to be able to respond quickly to issues. Similarly with CQC regulation and the Ombudsman. So just sort of moving on to operational challenges. So what do people tell us when we're in organisations? What are we seeing? Well, we know that housing is not always a career of choice. I chose it as a career of choice. I know my colleague Kirsty did. Often it's a career choice that people make further on down the line. But what we are now seeing is senior leaders exiting the sector, probably more quickly than they would have thought they would have done, and taking early retirement or moving into other career pathways. And they're telling us they feel stressed, they feel burnt out. They actually don't feel that they can continue leading organisations because of the competing pressures that they're having to deal with. And Vikki touched on the competency and conduct standard and the requirement around CIH qualifications. Certainly when I was a very young housing officer, we all undertook CPD and professional qualifications. That was part and parcel of our personal development. That will create some tensions in organisations around the ability to release staff, the impact on resources and also cost. And recruitment, we're seeing people really struggle to recruit and retain staff. That can create all sorts of issues around gaps in terms of service and frontline delivery. And this is something now that the sector is looking at far more closely. So just moving on then to the working environment. So again, what people are telling us, how are they feeling about being at work? How does it feel for them on a daily basis? And there's some common themes that you will see from the conversation that Vikki's already imparted. Heather, you touched on social purpose, really interesting there. You know, we're not measuring social value. There's lots of KPIs that we have to measure. But generally people feel there's a lack or a loss of social purpose, and that does really detract away from the customer and that customer focus, and also can create a lack of empathy for tenants, and very much around what Vikki's just said, that self-reflection, that professionalism and that personal development. All of these things are critically linked. People tell us that they don't have a clarity around what's expected of them now. Roles and responsibilities have changed significantly over the years, and often that can lead to a lack of accountability, a lack of feeling empowered to make decisions or actually to resolve a problem that may be communicated to them from the front line. We do see blame culture, unfortunately, and this is a really common theme when we go into organisations. Again, with staff who are delivering within neighbourhoods, when things go wrong, they feel that they're not necessarily listened to, and they don't necessarily feel fully trained or able to carry out their roles and responsibilities. That needs to be turned into a learning culture. So how can we empower people? How can people learn? How can they deliver? How can they feel empowered to actually support their tenants? Communication always comes up as a key issue. I don't think we've done a cultural review or assessment where communication hasn't been really high up there in terms of issues people want to see improved. And that generally is about inconsistent communication, methods of the way people are communicated with, or the amount of information shared with people within organisation. Some of that can be perceptual, but if it's their perception, it's their reality. And that does impact on morale. People want to know what's happening in the organisation. They want to share their ideas and their thoughts and their views, and they want to be listened to. We've seen a lot of issues around outdated housing management systems and processes and a lack of investment. However, I would say that probably over the last 12 months, organisations are now really thinking about how much investment is required now in terms of ensuring that there are accurate systems, accurate data, accurate processes in place, and aligning with new AI. So how's AI going to influence the service delivery going forward, and how's that going to impact on people's roles and responsibilities? We've seen a lack of investment in training and personal development over probably the last decade, I would think. Again, hopefully that will change now, and organisations are now starting to think about how they can really invest in training and personal development. And just turning to processes, some of the key themes that we see here is around reward and recognition, but more importantly, that's very much linked to health and well-being. So it's not necessarily about salaries or remuneration. It's very much around the support that's available for colleagues in organisations, having someone to talk to when things go wrong and being listened to. If we turn to that sort of middle management tier now, what they tell us is they often feel disempowered with a lack of the ability to influence upwards. They feel left to make their own decisions or come up with solutions that aren't necessarily reflective of what's required throughout the whole of the business. So there's inconsistencies there. So investment in that middle management tier, leadership investment in training and in personal development is really important. And that's, again, a really common theme that we see at that middle management level. And then a lack of processes, not using customer information, not using customer experience. So listening to those customers, understanding how those customers can influence change in the organisation around processes and operating practices. So these are all common themes that we see from and have seen from a whole range of different organisations. So coming on to the impact on tenants and residents, and we always want and try to include tenants when we conduct any sort of cultural assessment. They're the customers of the organisation. They can tell us exactly how they feel, their experience of the services that they've been delivered, and actually what their aspirations are going forward. So some of the themes that we again see when we're undertaking workshops and sessions with tenants, it's around the customer experience. So often people say, we don't feel we've been involved. We don't feel that the response that we've received with regard to a complaint or an issue that we have with our tenancy or our neighbourhood has been dealt with quickly enough, has been dealt with effectively, and has been impersonal. So again, picking up on Vicky's point about listening to people, about being able to respond to people's needs, but the way that they are actually heard in an empathetic way, but also in an approach that actually will mean that, you know, their issue can very much be dealt with quickly and effectively. Customer service response times, again, another emerging theme. We've touched on call centres. Some call centres do an amazing job, but unfortunately what we do experience when we're talking to tenants is they see slow response times and long call waiting times. There is a lack of personal contact. I started off by sharing my own sort of career pathway. And as a housing officer, we were very visible within neighbourhoods. We were out on the estates. People knew who we were. They would come and talk to us. That was a long time ago, and I accept that. However, tenants are telling us that there is nothing as good as personal contact. They like to know who their housing officer is. They want to see people in the neighbourhoods, and they want to understand actually how they can contact somebody and get their issues resolved. Sometimes they just want to talk to people. There's a lot of vulnerability issues there, and actually loneliness and isolation. And seeing somebody occasionally can make such a difference to those people. Repairs, you will know, it's always a main bone of contention, and that always comes through cultural reviews. Repairs being done right first time is what people expect, and understandably so. There's always a mixed feedback around attitudes of contractors, and again being listened to and respectfulness when people are in their homes undertaking repairs. So what do tenants and residents tell us that they really want and expect from their landlord? They tell us that they want to be respected. They really want to have that person-centred approach. They want to be listened to. They want to see and hear and feel that there is empathy for them. But more importantly, they want people that talk to them to own the issue and actually have the ability to resolve that issue, not having to wait for somebody else to make a decision. They want transparency, very clear and concise communication. If they've got an antisocial behavioural issue within their neighbourhood, they want to know how it's going to be dealt with, when it's going to be dealt with, and actually what else needs to be done if they need to provide additional information. Mutual trust, they want to feel that they can trust their landlord, and that actually as a customer, as a tenant, as a resident, that they, their voice is being heard. And finally, safety. They want well-maintained, warm homes that actually are compliant, but they also want neighbourhoods they feel safe to live in and actually feel comfortable to invite their friends and relatives along to their homes. And it is people's homes, and I think, it's about sort of remembering that. So what needs to change? I think we generally feel, from our experience working in the sector for sort of 35 years as an organisation, and talking to an awful lot of people across the UK, it feels to us that it is about reshaping that housing profession. It's about ensuring that the empathy is put back into housing, that housing is a profession that people are really proud to be part of, that our reputation is seen as one that should be an amazing reputation. We deliver some fantastic work. You do it on the ground. That needs to be recognised. So for us, firstly, people, it's about refocusing on people, both your colleagues who work in organisations and your tenants, your customers, your residents. You can't impact and influence cultural change unless your people understand that they're part of that journey and actually understand what's expected of them, and that they are part of the solution going forward. And that is about behaviours, it's about listening, it's about acting, and it's about influencing. It's about having very clearly defined values and behaviours in organisations. Because, for me, and I use the terminology golden thread, that should flow throughout the organisation. It's not top down. It should be part of everybody's day role, responsibilities, daily operational delivery. Leaders are so important in terms of cultural change. Not sitting in an office and closing the door. It's about visibility. It's about people knowing that they can come and talk to the Chief Executive, to the board members, and actually share their thoughts, ideas. We see some amazing leaders in this section who are incredibly visible and are, very approachable and actually make huge change in their organisation. Visionary, accountable and inspirational leaders, but having that open and honest culture, being able to talk to people and say if something's gone wrong, how do we learn from that? Let's not blame somebody, let's really understand what needs to change. I've touched on managers, empowering your managers. They are the filling in the sandwich. If they feel disempowered, information won't flow up and information will not flow down. And then employee engagement is absolutely critical. Your employees are your absolute key assets in those businesses, and they are delivering the services. So listening to feedback, even if you don't agree with it, talk to them and tell them why, and not just ignore that. So I hope sharing some of the insights from the work that we've done across the UK with our clients and the feedback from tenants has been helpful. And Vikki, lots of common themes there, and I'm sure that Shaun now is going to follow with LHP's experience. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Helen. No one has raised their hand currently. I'll just check if anyone has any questions they want to ask Helen now, but I'm conscious of time, so we might just move straight on to Shaun's presentation and then open up discussion at the end of the session, if that's okay with everybody. Nobody's put their hand up, so Shaun, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty, and morning, everybody. So I'm going to give you the view of a housing association, relatively sort of small one. We have been one of ARK's clients, so a lot of what both Vikki and Helen have gone through resonates. It's worth saying, Kirsty said, as Kirsty explained, I moved across from government into social housing just over 3 years ago. I was just reflecting, listening to Vicky's section, that when I joined, so we're talking autumn 22, we were dealing with building safety as a sector. We were still dealing with the aftermath of Grenfell. We were preparing for emerging new consumer regulations. At that time, inflation rocketed. We had the cost of living crisis start to bite. We had the huge media scrutiny around damp and mould. I can remember that was after about 2 months of me joining the sector. We were dealing with significant backlogs in repairs and voids in particular from COVID. Internally in LHP, there were real divisions around furlough, who'd been furloughed, who hadn't, a kind of divide opening up between customer-facing teams, particularly repairs operatives, and central services back office, a sense that some had it comfy, some didn't. We had issues around pay. There was disengagement with our employee engagement mechanisms. It was quite a time to come into that organisation. This organisation turnover was set to be 25% for the second year running. And then we spent a year engaged in a merger that didn't come off. Then our chief executive left, so we had a period of drift, waiting for a new permanent CEO. So if you fast forward 3 years or to a couple of months ago, when our CEO left and the board asked me if I would be interim CEO for a period of up to 12 months, I obviously grabbed that opportunity. I was really honoured. And the way I talked about it with the board is they understood, they recognised that people-centred change and culture were the magic ingredients. They were what are going to really turn our business around and ensure that we got to C1 because we'd been inspected. We got our results about a year ago, so we were in that first wave of the new inspection regime. So we retained our G1 V2. We got a C2, which we welcomed. That was fair. So from our board's point of view, attaining that C1 meant that we were moving from providing good customer services to consistently great. So it's been quite. I've been doing the role for about 3 months, and it took me a few weeks to stop worrying that I didn't have the right experience. I wasn't operational. I didn't have a financial background. I had a word with myself one day and just said, no, hang on. Think about why the board's asked you to do this and go for it. Like properly take everything I believe, everything we've been working on, and from the CEO position, make it real. So that's a bit of context for just a couple of things I want to say this morning, which summed up by that title. But there is a big push on professionalism. It's the right thing. We need that as a sector. We're embracing that as an organisation. In fact, we were audited earlier this year, and for an organisation of our size, we're doing pretty well on adapting to the professional standards. But competence and culture both matter. You can't have success without both, and everyone has a role. So I'll quickly expand upon that and then ground it in LHP's current experience. And we went through a culture review with ARK this time last year, with the results coming earlier this year, and it's really underpinned our approach to change. We've refreshed our values. Everything we're trying to do to provide a better customer experience comes from that. So let me just quickly explain a bit more. So as I say, really believe that professionalism is super, super important, but it's only half the story. And culture and leadership make it real. And I think that message has come through strongly from the other panelists today. Think about it in terms of qualifications and standards. They really matter. That they're the floor we should all stand upon. But on their own, I guess I worry they risk becoming box ticking. A couple of people go on a course if you're being cynical about it. Culture, on the other hand, is the ceiling, right? And if we think about empathy, compassion, respect, accountability, empowerment, as Vikki and Helen have described, they all matter hugely, and they're the secrets to success. If we only talk, to kind of come back around this sort of parallel, if we only talk about values without competence underneath, then they risk becoming words on posters rather than deeds. So it really is that combination. And when we do combine both competence and culture, we can build trust with customers. We can improve and increase accountability within and across teams, and ultimately deliver the outcomes people actually want to feel in their daily lives. So let me just explain what that means at LHP. So we definitely wanted to move beyond abstract strategies, and we had done a culture review just before I arrived. It was really abstract. It was very clever, lots of spidergrams. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do with it. And so we, working with ARK this time last year, the message, I kept saying to Helen and Kirsty is, let's go deep. We brought ARK in because they were independent, because of those issues around our employee engagement mechanisms. We weren't hearing from certain parts of the business, particularly property colleagues, particularly repairs. We were getting nil returns. They clearly didn't want to tell us how they felt. They probably thought nothing will change as a result. So brought ARK in to do that review, to provide that independence. And it was, nothing was off the table. And we wanted that genuine, honest view from colleagues and customers. So we had two phases to it. We also went out, not when I say we, the ARK team went out and talked to our customers in quite a lot of depth. What's it like to receive services from LHP? How do LHP colleagues behave? What's good, what's not? So a really open, honest, genuine, comprehensive culture review. And from that, it helped shape our change program. So, you get inspected. For those who haven't been through it, you get inspected. In our case, we get that C2. We agree an action plan with the regulator signed off by our board. We agreed we would achieve C1 by March 2027. I then set up a change program in order to oversee that and coordinate it. And the board provided some additional investment, which I'll quickly come back to. But there's a reason I called it Every Day Better. And I'll come on to that very quickly in a moment. The important thing was to say that the first thing we did was refresh our values. Colleagues said, we want to work for a social purpose organisation with a strong sense of values, but our current values, or our previous now, they feel abstract, they feel top down, they're inconsistently applied. So Helen Scurr and I we took all of the workshop research feedback, and we looked for common terms between us. I then put it through AI to create a long list. I then we held lots of engagement sessions with colleagues, including repairs, 2 repairs, roadshows, big events with colleagues. We put the long list to colleagues. We said, this is what our customers are telling us. They want us, this is how they want us to behave. What resonates with you? I then, with a team, we start to make sense of those values, and I'll show those in a moment. And look, it's really important to anchor everything in those values, but that takes time, and it's really hard. And it starts at the top, right? So as leaders, we're already having more open conversations with customers. So I created, I am a comms pro at heart. That's my background. I created a program called Authentic Conversations. So internally, start to just loosen things up. coffee and cake. The execs are in the building. Come and have a cup of tea. Tell us how you feel. Nothing's recorded. There's no agenda. Also, some more sort of semi-formal formats. With customers, we had started to do virtual sessions with them, but we tended to filter the questions. So we were like, oh, there's 5 questions about repairs. Repairs director, talk about repairs. But our customer-facing teams don't get to filter, do they? That's my diagnosis. They go into our customers' homes on an hourly, daily basis, and they don't know what they're going to get hit with most of the time. They face all sorts of questions, all sorts of comments. So we're switching that up now. So as an exec team, we've got 11 designated neighbourhoods agreed with our customers. Next year, starting in January, we're going to host events. We're going to go around every neighbourhood on a monthly basis and talk to customers and say, tell us how it feels. I go to the customer forum. They're not difficult. They're not easy meetings. They're really difficult. But you have to put yourself in there as leaders, and we have to show the rest of the organisation that it's okay. And we should be vulnerable, and we should be humble, and we should apologise, and we should fix things. And we should also catch the things that are working well and not completely talk ourselves down. Really important to say, having run the HR team for years, culture isn't a HR project. It's not an AD project. They are enablers. It's got to be owned by everybody. And the big early lesson from our change program is it's not about the big strategies. It's not even about the big investment projects, however important they are. It's about those everyday moments. It's about those behaviours that build trust. So just very, very quickly, we reset our narrative. It reflects what our customers have told us. And we did this in partnership with our managers and team leaders, that middle layer of the organisation, that glue that Helen talked about. I won't read it all, but I will pick out 2. Our mission is focused on the core, the basics done well. And if I look at repairs, there's been repairs transformation, there's been repairs modernisation. We now call it repairs stabilisation. Let's just fix the fundamentals, and then we can have a different conversation about what we might do with AI, what we might do with new technology. But our change program this year, year 1, is about people and it's about processes. And where we've got additional investment from the board, we put it into people. We put it into more repairs operatives, more team leaders, more people in the call centre, and a couple more in management. We're then looking at processes. We're getting teams together, people talking to people, looking at what's getting in the way, why we have so many workarounds and variations. Next year, we'll do this in December with our board. We'll make the case for technology. We'll make the case for systems. And underpinning all of that is a load of work on data. But it's the basics done well, every day better. Can we make things a little bit better for our customers and our colleagues day in, day out? What does that mean? That's culture. That's culture change. That's leadership. That's EDI. That's just practical, consistent, everyday improvement. And then customer promise. We listen and we deliver what matters to you. And I think we did have a version of that, was we put the customer at the heart of our business. When we tested that, it didn't mean anything, did it? It was a cliche. It was platitudinous. So there we go. There's some verbs in there. We listen and we deliver what matters to you. Now, just very quickly on our values, I did do a little bit of, there is a bit of poetic license in there because we didn't have accountability, we had ownership. And I spent a journey from Grimsby, where I work, back to Leeds, where I live, going, I've got to come up with a mnemonic. I've got to come up with something that really memorable. I switched ownership to accountability. I rearranged the words. I was like, oh, bloody hell, that makes up the word treat. And then I said to the organisation, there's a timeless principle of being a human being, right? We treat people how we wish to be treated ourselves. So we call this our treat framework now. And the important thing is, Kat, who you've heard, who jumped in earlier to ask Vikki a question, her and her team are going to create a behaviours framework. But guess what? They're going to go and design that with our customers first. They're going to go back to our customers and say, these are our values. What does a good set of behaviours look like flowing from these values? And what does what does an unnecessary or negative set of behaviours, and then we go back into the organisation and test that. So just finally, this is everyday better. We have some big projects that we've got to fix. We've got to stabilise repairs, make sure it's more timely and consistent. Big investment going into that. We've got to sort out our data. We don't quite understand everyone who lives in our home. We're good on stock condition. We need better data governance, better data training. The word better is tripping me up there. And we absolutely need to do more around customer influence. We have some really strong panels, but that's just a small sliver of our customer base. So we're doing loads around that, investing in co-design, as I've said. You can see a culture plan there, being better together. We like these simple phrases. There's a bunch of things that came out of that culture review that have been turned into programmes, as I've said. But I just want to read out a little bit of the script. And I wrote this myself because I wanted to set the tone. And I'd been working on the culture review with Helen and Kirsty. It's about making improvement a natural part of our culture, something we do every day, not just through big changes, but through small, meaningful actions that add up over time. For colleagues in all roles, this means focusing on getting the basics right, spotting opportunities to improve and making steady progress. Whether through customer-facing service or strategic decisions, everyone has a role to play in making things every day better for our customers. And that's LHP.